Okay, great. So hi, everybody. I'm Peter Schwartz. As most of you know, I'm the director of the IU Center for Bioethics. And in this capacity, the director of the Bioethics and Subject Advocacy program of the Indiana CTSI. And you are very welcome. We're very glad to have you here for our next TREATS talk, Translational Research Ethics Applied Topics. We do these monthly or every other month. They are meant to be a short introduction to an important topic, really mainly aimed at researchers rather than ethicists, although we can get into some pretty interesting topics even for ethicists. All of our talks are recorded and available on the IU Center for Bioethics website, which is bioethics.iu.edu under the Research Ethics site or under the ethics resources area. Please do visit that if you'd like this. And again, it's my great pleasure and honor to introduce Dr. Bill Schneider here today. I'm going to call him Bill because everybody call me Peter. You can call him whatever you want, just don't call him late to dinner. Bill is a true a titan. I'm going to call him a titan of ethics and medical humanities here at IU. He was involved, most importantly, in the creation of the IU Center for Bioethics. It's really the pinnacle of his career, in addition to his many acclaimed books and the enormous impact he's had on medical humanities and medical ethics at IU. He's professor of, I believe he's still professor of history, they put emeritus after your name, professor of medical humanities, other titles you can find on his website. And Bill has done a lot of lecturing in our courses through the years on the history of research abuses, research transgressions, and the source for our codes. And we decided that it's an important enough topic to put as a TREATS talk, to be available to people on the website, and to take advantage of Bill's truly encyclopedic and excellent knowledge of this area. Plus, he has a summary that'll be cited, they'll be referenced and available through our TREATS talk website as well. So with no further ado, and with great pleasure and great honor, I am introducing you Bill Schneider, to lead us through this. As usual, these are 20 or 30 minutes. Bill's been known to talk a little longer, kind of like myself. If it goes longer, that's fine. If it goes shorter, that's fine too. And then we'll have a discussion among all of us. I assume there'll be lots of questions and opportunities for discussion. I would say I think the topic of history and understanding where we come from is going to be essential in life in thinking about where we're going in research ethics and research more generally, and truly in medical ethics. So again, I'll go on mute and actually turn off my camera, and we'll hear from Dr. Schneider. Thanks, Bill.
Well, thank you very much, Peter. You went on too long, but that's okay. It's my pleasure to be able to give this talk about institutional review boards, which are probably the best known and widely considered the best protection against harm for human subjects of research. Certainly the case among academics. But exactly why and how the boards were established and how effective they are in achieving their purpose are questions best answered, I think, by beginning to look at the origins of IRBs. A couple of prefatory remarks. As Peter suggested, I'm not a healthcare provider. I am a researcher, but I don't do clinical research. I have done research in the history of medicine with funding from NIH and NSF, which has required me to use the institutional review boards. Essentially, I had to show that I didn't need to use the institutional review boards because there was no harm to the human subjects that were part of the research. We can go into that if you want, but that means I'm familiar with some of the criticisms, that is the bureaucracy, claims that the people don't really understand your research and so on, which maybe we can talk about. I would also, as Peter has said, this talk is based on a longer talk that I've given to the research ethics course that was established almost 25 years ago, following the guidelines of the Office of Research Integrity, requiring training by researchers in responsible conduct of research. This is hopefully a shortening. We'll see how it goes, but so much for the preface. Now, the two main points of this talk are, in explaining this, are that government regulation is not the only way of safeguarding against research misconduct. Generally, or protecting human subjects specifically. In addition to government researchers themselves, there's public scrutiny, especially nowadays the press, as well as researchers themselves who have a way of monitoring the research done by their fellow researchers. But from a larger perspective, the nature of research in broader society, the nature of government and public awareness are at the root of both the causes of harm to human subjects, as well as other research, and ways of guarding against it. So let me show you some pictures. And I'll try to talk to explain them. And try to give you something of a feel for how this works. So to begin with, one of the main points is that concern with what we call research involving humans goes back a long way. The question of research is actually kind of interesting. Oops. There you go. It's interesting, in a sense, any healer learns from the prescription and taking care of a patient. And in that sense, it's a kind of an experiment. The word experiment has the same root as the word experience. And so the experience of one caring for a patient is, in a sense, an experiment. You don't know until after you prescribe the treatment how it works out. So this kind of empirical trial and error is from long ago how the various remedies were developed. And the care of patients is something that has been monitored by governments going back. We have evidence going all the way back to Hammurabi's Code, some 3,000 or 4,000 years. We're most familiar with the dictum of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, and this actually applied to physicians in one of the codes that if a physician makes an incision with an operating knife and kill him, or open a tumor or operating knife and cut out the eye, his hand shall be cut off. Another evidence of long-standing ways of researchers monitoring or practitioners monitoring their fellow practitioners, we can see in the Hippocratic Oath that goes back 2,500 years that MDs today, a variation of it, swear in their white coat ceremonies. We're most familiar with this as a list of things that shall not be done, ultimately no harm being done to the patient. But the oath is actually part of what we can call a kind of a guild practice, where the person who has been an apprentice enters the practice with fellow practitioners, and the fellow practitioners monitor what's done by all who are part of the guild, such that if there is malpractice, then they're held accountable. And of course, this is something that applies in other circumstances as well, and carries on down to the present day. More like the kind of research we think of was also practiced in ancient times. And some of the best known writers and researchers we can point to, and they were also conscious of harm and took steps to minimize harm to their research subjects. Galen in ancient Rome, 2nd century AD, if you look at this picture, you can see that is not a portly person that's being dissected, but it's a large pig. Experiments on animals were a very important way to this day of minimizing harm to humans. If something new is being tried, it's first tried on animals. Avicenna, a physician and philosopher from 11th century Persia, also left a lengthy treatise on how one learns, advocating doing testing on animals as well, and how one should test and how one should learn from the experiments. So the bottom line of this these long-standing practices is that government and professions, as well as religion and the public, have long acted to protect individuals and community interests. So a major change in both the practice of research as well as potential for harm and ways to protect against it came in the 1600s with what we call the scientific revolution. Scientific revolution, best known for the discoveries coming out of the Renaissance and learning reviving the learning of ancients and also expanding it. We're earliest known discoveries were in physics and the laws of motion, but there was also investigation of humans and what we call medicine as well. Its, of course, greatest importance is the method itself that include such things as controlled observation and quantitative measurement and so on. One of the results of the scientific revolution was to expand the number of people doing research. And since it was applied to humans, there was an increased possibility of harm to humans. But the numbers of people involved were small individuals, most often, in fact, the researchers themselves. They did experiments on themselves or their family members. A couple of examples, as early as William Harvey in 1628, who published his discoveries of the circulation of the blood. Almost all of the experiments and dissections were, well, all the dissections were on animals, many animals. There's actually an interesting film that was made in the 1950s, recreating the experiments that Harvey did on all sorts of animals to finally figure out just how and where the various vessels that came were connected to the heart ultimately met each other, although capillaries were too small to be seen by the microscopes of the day. He finally figured out that there was a circulation because he ultimately measured the volume of the last chamber of the heart and the number of times the heart beat, and realized that the 60 times 60 times so on meant that 200 pounds of blood was leaving the last chamber of the heart, and therefore it had to go somewhere. This continued on to Edward Jenner, perhaps another discovery, who demonstrated a safer way to inoculate against smallpox. Inoculation had been discovered earlier by the Chinese in the 10th century, but he observed milkmaids in rural England at the end of the 1700s who acquired immunity to smallpox because of their exposure to an animal form of the disease, cowpox, which was much less risky. Giving a person a mild case of smallpox ran the risk of getting a major case, which could be 20 or 30% fatal. In the time of an epidemic, this was judged to be worthwhile. But with cowpox, the minimal risk was something that was quickly adopted by governments in England, France, and elsewhere with some resistance. He first tested the practice, though, on his own child, and then a child who was a neighbor in his town, although there was some resistance, as we'll see in a minute. There's examples of concern with the research in the scientific revolution, perhaps the best known of which was the work of Galileo and his examination of the heavens and his conclusion that Copernicus was right and the earth goes around the sun. He faced trial by the Pope, not in a religious sense, but since the Pope was in charge of the government, where Galileo was a university professor in Florence, he was brought to trial, ultimately forced to confess, and rescinded his conclusion of his book that he published. This is obviously now seen as an unwarranted interference of government with research. Less well known about the same time was a French doctor, practitioner, who was brought to trial by the widow of a man who died after Denise gave him a transfusion with calf's blood shortly after the discovery of the circulation of the blood. It was realized that blood from either people, especially young men, or animals with a certain disposition might influence the nature of someone who was suffering and could use an infusion of blood. In this case, the person died. Denise was acquitted, but the French courts banned transfusion for the next 150 years. An important element allowing the practitioners to guard against misconduct and safeguard people that were subject to research was the review and verification by researchers. And Harvey, when he made his discovery, published it in a short book. The invention of the printing press in the late 1400s made it possible for people to publish results, publish all sorts of things, including those doing research and making their research known. But the numbers, it was costly, and the people that could do this were limited. But within about 40 years of Harvey's discovery, a new way of reporting research was developed, the scientific journal. It's interesting how it started. It started by correspondence between researchers who would send letters to one another. And pretty soon, a few people, especially in Paris and London, got known as having a long list of people they could send letters to. And so they received letters from researchers, and then they would send out the results to their list. This is kind of a letters to the editor, which then became soon translated into a scientific journal. This was a way of both spreading the results of what was found, and it had other implications. If we look at the various features of the scientific method that many of us may remember from the science fairs, or if you have children, from the various steps that we memorize, most of the emphasis is on formulating a hypothesis and testing it with an experiment and so on. But crucial in the sense of safeguards was gathering information, previously what we call literature search, and in the end, publishing the results. There are two important consequences of this that are often neglected. First, it both spread the knowledge and meant that one did not have to reinvent the wheel. One built on the shoulders of giants. Unlike the guilds that kept secret their knowledge, one of the key reasons for the success of the scientific revolution was both building on the knowledge of others and spreading it to everyone else. It also, however, helped ensure the quality and integrity of the research results. The editors themselves would be one way of verifying the validity of the research, but by sending it out to everyone else, it was a way of others being able to judge whether there was either deliberate fraud or cheating, or even unintended wishful thinking or conclusions based on insufficient evidence, and of course, mistreatment of subjects of the research. The next major change in research and ways of safeguarding people involved in the research came in the 1800s, the 19th century. This was largely the result of broader changes in society that are too long to go into, but briefly listed, including the Industrial Revolution, the increase in wealth and urbanization, more democratic governments in the course of the 19th century, meaning that the governments who might monitor research were responsible to more people, government funding and the growth of universities increased the number of researchers. At the same time, science was professionalized. The American Medical Association, formed in 1847, was a way for them to both accomplish a number of things, but in addition to that, monitor the work of their members. There was also, because of increasing education of the public and literacy, popular awareness of science, and reaction to it in mass culture, especially with Romanticism, and as we'll see, some reactions to science like Frankenstein, which we'll see in a minute. The key to changing medical research, we don't have time to go into this, was what's called hospital medicine at the beginning of the 1800s. It actually came first in France after the French Revolution in 1789, when the government abolished religion, took over the hospitals, which were run by them. Hospitals up until that time were essentially places where the poor were housed and cared for to a certain extent by typically nursing orders, nuns who would care for them. Physicians took care of patients at the bedside. But the hospitals run by the government had a responsibility, and a new generation of doctors went to the hospitals to both care for patients. And they realized that this was a place where they could learn a lot more from a larger number of patients. In other words, hospitals became a place where there were large numbers of people. The hospitals soon changed from being places for the sick and poor to the best place for diagnosis and treatment by the end of the 19th century. The kind of, we don't have time to go into this, but a French philosopher, Michel Foucault, saw the ability of researchers to do research on poor people who came to be treated as a kind of a tacit contract where, in exchange for free treatment, they agreed to be the subjects of what he called the gaze, or research. Likewise, when the government took over hospitals, those paying the government through taxes benefited, because even though the poor were being treated with their expenses the results of them would benefit them, and the physician could save the lives of the rich as well. Both of these, to a certain extent, continue to the present day. But getting back to the practice of medicine and more explicit care and monitoring of abuse, laboratory medicine developed at the same time as hospital medicine after the chemical revolution, which began about the same time and beginning to a certain extent in France, with an understanding of the way the material world changed from the four elements going back to the ancient Greeks of air, earth, fire, and water to the discovery of what we now call the table of elements and how they combine to form molecules, and with equations to describe them. This ability to understand and refine these things applied to chemicals used in medical care and treatment, including very early on anesthesia and antisepsis, which had tremendous repercussions for the expansion of surgery. At the same time, instruments for examining these large numbers of patients in the hospitals quickly developed, beginning with the stethoscope, which was an extension of listening to a patient, especially the chest, where one could listen to the heart and listen to the lungs, as opposed to simply feeling for the pulse or watching breathing. All sorts of other developments for better instruments from microscopes to monitoring blood pressure, culminating before the end of the 1800s with the discovery and application of X-rays. All of these things led to tremendous improvements in practice of medicine, producing, among other things, the discovery of cell theory and germ theory, revolutionizing in a fundamental way the understanding of health, illness, and healing from a balance of humors of Hippocrates in ancient Greece to disease that was based in organs and cells as well as physiological functions, and a race to discover the causes of contagious diseases. However, the 19th century also brought popular understanding and critiques of medicine and science, and a call for more systematic calls for protection of human subjects of research. A couple of illustrations of the public critique that can be seen here. If you look at the diagram on the right and look carefully, this is a bird in a glass bell, and this experiment being carried out here is to remove the air from the shell to show that the bird will eventually suffer and die. The reaction that the painter is showing here varies from the researcher himself here to people who look away and even can't stand the suffering of the animals, of the bird. More explicit critique is seen over here on the left, which is a cartoon from 1802 and a reaction against Jenner's discovery of the new way to prevent smallpox. Injecting something from animals into humans was seen as not exactly pleasant, with people growing horns and things growing out of their arms and foreheads. Reaction against vaccinations is obviously something that continues to the present day. Another cartoon showing a reaction against blood transfusion, making fun of Napoleon here, receiving an injection of blood from a tiger in order to give him the courage to face the English. This is a British cartoon. Better known in the 19th century in literature are critiques of medical research, as we can call it. Perhaps the best known, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, dating back to 1819. Robert Louis Stevenson's Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, another example. Now, there was also, because of the increased research that was done with humans, there were also the beginnings of proposals and examples of procedures to protect the subjects of human research. And I'm going to give you 3 examples and try to quickly mention what they illustrate. The first of these is William Beaumont, who was an army doctor on the northwest frontier at Fort Mackinac in Michigan after the War of 1812. In 1822, a young Canadian fur trapper came with an accidental gunshot wound to his stomach. Beaumont treated it, but after healing, a flap developed over the stomach, which actually, if lifted up allowed access to the stomach. And what Beaumont did, maybe being out on the frontier like that, gave him the time to do this. He did a series of experiments on how the function of the stomach worked in digestion, dropping foods in with tied to a string, extracting fluid, and doing results in vivo as well as in vitro. And he published the results in 1833 in the Physiology of Digestion. As part of this, Beaumont signed an agreement with Saint Martin. An agreement, it's a doctor of, it was basically employment as a servant, and in exchange for lodging and payment of $150 a year, Saint Martin also agreed, quote, to assist and promote by all means in his power such philosophical or medical experiments as the said William shall direct or cause to be made on, or in the stomach of him. As far as the features of what Beaumont guaranteed to do, the investigator must be conscientious and responsible. The voluntary consent of the subject is necessary, and the experiment is to be continued when it causes distress to the subject. Whether this was voluntary consent, some have argued may be questionable, since Saint Martin was pretty clearly illiterate, given that his signature on the document was an X. By the way, the other feature of this is that this is the old style experiment on one person, a very limited number of subjects. Claude Bernard, in the middle of the 19th century, was a very famous French physiologist who was responsible for especially discovering the functions of the liver, as well as formulating the idea of homeostasis, the internal milieu. In addition to his large numbers of researchers, he did most of his experiments on animals, but also published a book in 1865 on experimental medicine, which he spent a lot of time talking about conducting research, including such observations that to perform an experiment on anyone that can save a life is not just the right, but the duty. But it's wrong to perform an experiment which might be harmful to him in any extent, even though the result might be highly advantageous to science. Final example at the end of the century comes, and it's more fully an example of research with large numbers of subjects, comes from Walter Reed, who headed a commission to Cuba in 1900 after the Spanish-American War to study yellow fever. In the Spanish-American War between the United States and Spain and Cuba, 300 or 400 soldiers died from wounds on the battlefield, and a couple of thousand died from disease. And among the most dangerous of diseases was yellow fever. Reed and his commission tested the vector for transmitting yellow fever that was discovered by Cuban doctor Carlos Finley. And the way they tested it was to collect mosquitoes which had bitten infected patients and then have them bite those that had not been exposed. The volunteers were drawn mainly from American soldiers, but also some other American personnel, as well as the Cuban inhabitants. There were some deaths, and they were criticized by the newspapers back in the United States. So that's another element that we can see here in this experiment. But of note is the actual written consent forms that were developed by Reed to be signed by each of the volunteers. This is actually in Spanish, signed by one of the Spanish volunteers or Cuban volunteers, which contains that the person understands well that in the case of danger, in the case of developing the fever, the life will be in danger, but that he will receive the greatest care. A sum of $100 in American gold, which was a lot of money at that time, was also part of the agreement. So to summarize by this latest change in the 19th century of codes of conduct and experimentation, several of the main features of what later became codes were evident by the end of the 19th century, including a notion of risk versus benefit, as well as informed consent. But these practices were not very widespread or very broadly binding. Which leads us to the 20th century, which in many ways continued the developments of the 19th century as far as number of subjects and things to be taken into account and so on. And these include, for example, that, but also becoming even more so the case, So public awareness and public concern continued to rise as the public became even more aware of what was going on, mass press and public opinion. Democratic governments spread even more in the 20th century, which were more responsible to their subjects. There was increased support for research, not just by universities, but also the government providing research, as well as foundations, the Rockefeller Foundation, and as we'll see ultimately in the last part of the 20th century in the United States, National Endowment for National Institutes of Health. Research itself changed, requiring more subjects for research, especially the discovery of germ theory and infectious diseases. And the treatments required large numbers of subjects, and large numbers of subjects were found not just in hospitals, but also in schools and in prisons and in asylums. And these became the places where large numbers of subjects were found for research. There were also some unpredictable accidents in the 20th of history in the 20th century, most important of which were world wars that produced, in addition to unprecedented government spending on research, including medical research, a change in the balance of the benefit versus risks. Wartime, like epidemics, have increased benefits for doing research, and therefore it loosens or increases the willingness to take risks. This was actually the case in the United States, but of course most notoriously in the experiments of the Nazis and Japanese medical experiments in concentration camps. So it's been documented, some of these abuses in American medical research. We don't have time to go into them, but some examples, some of these, the Committee on Medical Research that was established during the war provided tremendous funding for 200 or 300 experiments, most of which were very beneficial and quite spectacular, the most spectacular of which was the ability to produce penicillin in quantities large enough to treat people, which was perhaps the most important cure discovered. And other experiments were also quite successful. But a few of these have been noted afterwards, wherein there was not sufficient protection of subjects, including vaccine that was attempted to be developed against dysentery, which was done at orphanages and institutions for the, quote, feeble-minded. The source of quinine to protect against malaria, with the American troops having to go fight in the South Pacific, was important when the Japanese took over the trees that produced quinine. So a synthetic form was important to be developed. And many of these synthetics were tested on mental patients. The vaccine against influenza was seen as being very important because of what happened after World War I with the 1918 pandemic. And so many attempts to find vaccines for influenza were tested on institutions for the, quote, retarded. The Japanese research was on a whole other scale and a whole other level. Not as well known as the Nazi experiments, but the Japanese Unit 731 was a subject of horrendous use of prisoners for various hypothermia experiments, testing plague. They actually tested germ warfare, which was used against populations in Korea and Manchuria. Vivisection, which is actual experimentation on living humans, was also part of it. But the best known of the abuse, these horrendous abuses, was by the Nazis, and we know about it because of the trial and the ultimately the Nuremberg Code that came out of the trial for the German doctors. In December 1946, the military tribunal opened proceedings against 23 leading German physicians. This was following the war crime trials previously. And this was for them being willing participants in crimes against humanity. The specific charges are quite lengthy as what they did as far as experiments, high altitude freezing experiments, spotted fever sterilization experiments, prisoners to test what would happen to pilots in the air at low altitude. Oxygen was removed from chambers. There's an example of experiments with seawater that were far worse than these, where prisoner camp inmates were shot in order to see what happened with infections from gunshot wounds, as well as, well, I don't need to go on. The results of the trial of the 23 defendants, 7 were acquitted, 7 received death sentences, and the remaining received sentences from 10 years to life. Two of the American doctors who were consultants to the trial, Andrew Ivey and Leo Alexander, submitted a memorandum at the end for the judges to use, and they included it in a section called Permissible Medical Experiments, the 10 points of which have now become known as the Nuremberg Code. The main points of the code, if you're not familiar with it, range from voluntary consent being needed to the quality of the experiments and the experimenters based on animal experimentation, and as well as the question of risk being warranted, for the degree of risk being warranted by the importance of the research being done. No experiment safeguards, no experiment should be done if death or disabling injury could occur, and scientists must be prepared to terminate the experiment at any stage. The Nuremberg Code did not carry the force of law, but it was a pretty complete statement about the use of humans in experiments, and was pretty much the basis of subsequent codes. But it was very naive as far as its assumptions about enforcement. And as I said, it did not carry any force of law. Meanwhile, another result of the Second World War was government funding of research, which was extended after the war and became the basis of the National Science Foundation in the United States, as well as NIH. I see I'm going on a little long, I better hurry up. Here's a graph showing the amount of research that was funded from the 1950 to 1965. Bill, it's a logarithmic scale.
Take your time, Bill.
Okay.
Take your time, it's fine. It's great.
All right.
It's a very in-depth thing, and I think you're doing a terrific job. So take as much as you take.
I hope you can see if people are awake. I can't tell, but anyway, funding from NIH beginning in 1950 of $15 million for external research grew to $593 million for external research in 1965. Here's a graph of scientific and technical journals from 1839, and you can see after World War II how this sort of dramatic rise shows the amount of research that was being done. Meanwhile, the adoption of the principles of the Nuremberg Code was slow, as witnessed by the Declaration of Helsinki almost 20 years later. The World Medical Association was taking up the various features of it and finally coming up with essentially the same principles, but this was increased the awareness of people about the various problems and protocols, but it ultimately depended on national medical associations to adopt the various features of the Helsinki Declaration, and so it was of limited practical use as late as the mid-1960s. And meanwhile, what had happened is examples of scandals involving human subjects had arisen in those 20 years since Nuremberg, 2 of which were the Brooklyn Jewish Chronic Disease Hospital and the Willowbrook School for Mentally Retarded. The Brooklyn Jewish Hospital was a case where a story broke in 1964 at Cornell Medical School, where senile and demented patients at a hospital were given live cancer cells, so-called HeLa cells. You probably know about these from another experiment we don't have time to go into. The idea was to essentially try to immunize them against cancer, see if it would protect them. Subjects were told they were receiving some cells, the word cancer was omitted. Researchers said they obtained oral consent, but evidence showed that there were some attempts to cover up. Another famous example was the Willowbrook School for the Mentally Retarded, where some incoming patients were given a mild form of hepatitis. I believe this was hepatitis A, purposely in order to test for a possible vaccine. The rationale of researchers was that everyone in the school was getting this hepatitis, and they were testing for, they would be given special treatment and would be monitored. And ultimately they discovered hepatitis B in this, but the questionable research as far as how well parents were informed of their how their children were treated was a cause for concern. I want to focus though on Henry Beecher, who was arguably provided the most complete and persistent expose of these cases that ultimately led to the establishment of institutional review boards. Finally, we're here. Beecher was a professor of anesthesiology at Harvard, very much concerned with the ethics of research, and first presented his findings in March of 1965 in a conference paper wherein he described 18 cases of clinical research without the consent of subjects. These 18 cases were drawn from 22 he found from studying 50 in the published literature by researchers since 1948 at major US medical research centers. The article was published in early 1966. But to give you an example of them not being obscure or minor, the various research labs that conducted this questionable research is listed here at the bottom. Harvard, NIH, Western Reserve, these are the top medical research institutes. Nor were these secret. The journals that published these findings were the top medical journals in the field of medicine, the New England Journal of Medicine, JAMA, Journal of Clinical Investigation. Of note in Beecher's article was the reason he found for the ethical breaches. He attributed it primarily to the increase in research funding of NIH. His conclusion was that these resources for research are greater than the supply of responsible investigators. In other words, people weren't sufficiently qualified to do the research. Not that they were deliberate, but it was more a question, he said, of thoughtlessness and carelessness rather than the willful disregard of patients' rights. Equally interesting in Beecher's recommendation was his remedy. His remedy was that publication of experimental results must show, quote, informed consent has been obtained and the gain anticipated from an experiment must be commensurate with the risk involved. Now, this is currently the practice, but it was not the remedy adopted by the establishment of the regulation issued by the U.S. Public Health Service in February of 1986, called the Clinical Investigations Involving Human Subjects, wherein they, because of the publication of these various scandals, sought to find a way to protect research involving human subjects. So it's a short statement, which you can read maybe later. I won't read the whole thing, but essentially, rather than Beecher's proposal to tie enforcement to publication, it tied enforcement to funding. No new renewal or continuing grant was to be given unless the institution, and here's the other key element, it's the institution that takes the responsibility, should do a prior review by a committee of associates. In other words, not just the judgment of the researcher themselves. The point of it was to guard the rights and welfares of the individuals. And moreover, a statement of informed consent was not enough. It also had to describe the appropriateness of the methods involved, as well as the appropriateness of the risk versus the potential medical benefits of the investigation. This memo establishing review boards was very quickly amended as questions arose, and broadening the policy to more grants, question of who served on it, and the question of people beyond the question of standards as well. So the take-home point from the establishment of the review boards is that these were created in 1966, involved independent reviewers, and the mechanism tied to compliance, tied to funding, with compliance warranted by, monitored by the institutions where the researchers were settled, were employed. Now, I can't end this talk without mentioning the Tuskegee syphilis study, and I mentioned it as an example of a test of how effective government regulation is, as well as monitoring of research by fellow researchers or the press. As many of you probably know, in July, maybe not, you don't know it's July, but in 1972, a newspaper article revealed that a research study conducted by the Public Health Service beginning in 1932 involved hundreds of low-income African Americans with a high incidence of syphilis infection, periodically examined over 40 years to determine whether the course of the disease in African Americans from syphilis was different than the course of the disease in whites. Subjects were not told about their disease. And even though a proven cure existed at the time of the project beginning, salvarsan, and a much more effective one, penicillin, became available in the early 1950s. The study continued until 1972, with both participants and their families being denied treatment. Now, we can talk about this if you want, but I want to look at this from the standpoint of the question of, larger question of the effectiveness of guarding subjects of research. Tuskegee, obviously, the Tuskegee study, revelation of the study obviously heightened awareness of the need to protect human subjects and assure voluntary consent. It also increased suspicion among African American communities. But the question is, it was not something that was prevented either by the new IRB requirements of the government oversight. After all, the Tuskegee study was carried out by the very public health service that issued the requirements for IRBs. So they were unaware of the Tuskegee study. Moreover, the study was not prevented by the publication of results, because contrary to this editorial cartoon showing that the researcher was doing this in secret, results of the Tuskegee study had been published since the 1930s in the journal literature without it being able to recognize or stop the study. It was not one of the abuses that Beecher found, nor, as I said, did Public Health Service know about it. In fact, the Tuskegee study stopped because of a news report. Public health worker Peter Buxton told Jean Heller, a reporter for the Washington Star, about it, and she wrote the story on July 25th, 1972, that broke the story. Very quickly, within days, other newspapers picked it up, and it spread around the country, from Milwaukee to South Bend to St. Louis to Oregon and beyond. Editorial cartoons demonstrated that, and ultimately government action followed. As you can read here, we don't have time to go into it. Took a little while for the Public Health Service to end the study. Hearings began. A lawsuit was filed. Lawsuit was settled in 1974. Treatment finally extended to families in 1975, and Clinton's apology in 1997, you may remember. From our standpoint, finally, to summarize this talk, the Tuskegee experiment can obviously be seen as evidence that the safeguards that I've mentioned did not work. The government conducted the study. Three of the cases studied by Beecher was done by the government, and the government funded 11 of the cases that Beecher published in his article. Tuskegee results were published from the 1930s to the 1960s. 5 of Beecher's cases were published in the New England Journal of Medicine, and others. This did not result in them being recognized or stopped, at least immediately. And it took over 40 years until 1972 for the press to break the news about Tuskegee. On the other hand, in a broader sense, the safeguards eventually did work. IRBs and subsequent government regulations were established after 1966 as a result of partly Beecher's article, which depended on published reports of questionable experiments, as well as the government being aware of the published reports. And of course, the Tuskegee whistleblower knew about published literature, and Heller's Washington Post article got the government to do something. Changes to the IRBs have come afterwards, as you can see from this list, including the National Research Act. That actually followed largely from Tuskegee and ultimately resulted in the Belmont Report, Common Rule in 1981, and the 1994 NIH requirement of training for responsible conduct of research. And that's basically the origin of this talk, which came when Indiana University established its research ethics course that is still to this day being used to train researchers here at Indiana University. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing and go back and see if anybody's awake and if there's any questions or comments.
We're all awake, Bill, on the edge of our seats. I will defer to others. I can always grab you over coffee to ask you a million questions about what you said. But let's let anybody who'd like to go. Please go ahead, and Bill, you can call on them and raise your hands. Just start talking. Great, thanks.
Sure. Jane.
Hey, Bill, I wrote this in the chat, but I'm going to go ahead and read it. First of all, this is a great talk. I so appreciated it, and I'm sure you didn't put anybody to sleep at all. You know, the visuals are fantastic as well. I can see it took a great deal of time and attention to put together this information. I'm going to ask a really broad and general question because I think, you know, like many people, I've been really troubled by what we see as a kind of creeping anti-science mentality. And I wonder if it makes sense to understand today's anti-vax mentality as a cultural reaction, albeit a slow-moving one, on the part of social groups who historically have been disadvantaged by human subject testing in the era before informed consent and all this risk-benefit analysis had fully developed. You know, it almost feels like it's this kind of slow windup of irritation and of a way to kind of seize the authority or status that people didn't have earlier on. It's a very general question, and I don't know if you can answer it, but I'd be interested in your thoughts.
Well, yeah, okay, I'll briefly, reactions to vaccines have come and gone since Jenner spread it widely for a while. In the end of the 19th century, it was suspended in England, as you may know, but it has proceeded. Smallpox eventually was eradicated as a result of it. Anti-science skepticism has been there. It has served some good purposes. But the general pattern of science and medicine in particular has sort of reached, it's reached a kind of a golden age in the course of the 20th century to mid-century. And then the reaction against it, especially in the 60s, but even a little bit earlier, has come by patient authority, patient autonomy. There's a whole movement against it that has sort of brought science back from what arguably can still be called today an overconfidence. So it is a broad question, and there's been a waxing and waning, but the broad general pattern from what I've seen in the history of medicine is general rise of confidence and appreciation, not totally at all, through the mid 20th century, and then in the second half of the 20th century, sort of a, I won't call it a waning, but certainly a criticism of it, bringing it, I think, appropriately into a good accountability. Of course, you can also be abused. There's plenty of cases of abuse and real anti-science based on ignorance and prejudice and other things, politics perhaps, that's mixed into it as well. But those are the broad patterns that I'd comment on.
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
Anybody else? Do I see Eric Meslin's name really on this list?
Come on, guys, this is your chance. I can talk Bill's ear off all the time. So anybody with questions about this or about, okay, here we go. We have a chat one, Bill. Do you have chat open? I can read it to you, or David, you could read it. So we've got a question about public trust. It's interesting, and this is a moment, right, Bill? It's very interesting that we're in a moment now where Jane's question, now David's question is about trust and this current situation. I would say part of this, just to add some flavor to this a little more, because I can't help talking either, is that you know, you described a history where the place of science in society and status was continually questioned and continually struggling and developing and facing resistance of, as you said, reasonable and unreasonable. So it's interesting that this time we say, oh, this is all new. You know, rejecting science is all new. Science should be accepted as like it always has been. That's not the story you tell, I'd say. But anyway, now there are a lot of questions coming in here. Do you have your chat open, Bill? Do you want to choose which ones you
Yeah,
wish to
but it
respond to.
might be easier for you to read. Let me comment on the one about public trust in science. The answer is yes, it's both. It's both increased and there is sort of a questioning of science. It's the discoveries and the ability of science to do things is continues to defy all predictions of what it can do. On the other hand, I think it's legitimate, even for those within the scientific community, to be critical of science over-promising what it does. One other thing, the abuses of human subjects and its importance in questioning of science, I think is only part of the reason for questioning of science. One of the reasons for questioning of science in the mid-20th century was the AMA's opposition to universal health care. People resent doctors who were motivated, according to the critics, more by their own ability to gain income rather than gain wealth. This is not all doctors, but that certainly was one of the reasons. There's also the general questioning of authority in the 60s and after, and other movements as well that were important.
Yeah, so David, I see you came off mute and you came on camera. If you'll follow up your question, and then I'd like to get to Corey Rice's question also. Go ahead, David, if you'd like, or.
Yeah, the whole AMA opposing universal healthcare is interesting. Kind of reminds me of the current argument against so-called big pharma, their interest in medicine and medical ethics, and how that's making people question science today.
Yeah.
Corey,
Government funding of research is, of course, another element that's kind of a bargain because there isn't accountability, and there's sort of a legitimate question of taxpayers' money being used to support things that benefit the few rather than the pet taxpayers who pay for it.
Or betting no one at all.
Corey, would like to speak your question. If you don't, I can read it out to Bill.
Sure,
go ahead.
I can go ahead. Thank you so much, Dr. Schneider, for this talk. It's been fascinating. I'm actually an IU alum. I work in Vermont now at the VA in research. Yeah, so I'm really excited to be here. Well, in this Zoom environment, I guess. But my question is about translational science and how we balance the efforts of translational science and how the public kind of seemingly believes that they're their own experts, especially in terms of vaccinations that we were just talking about, and saying that they're doing their own research, yet they're technically are not the experts doing that research. They're just Googling stuff. However, I, as a researcher myself, I have to also appreciate the effort that's being done by the public to educate themselves on their own health. However, how do we balance all of that?
Well, obviously, I'm not sure it's not something I studied in depth. I can give you a reaction. I think that doctors have been fooling themselves all along, even in the golden age, to think that only they were the ones who ever prescribed how people treated themselves. People have self-treated from the beginning. There was a study done in the early 90s that showed that people were spending as much money on aromatherapy, GNC, take your pick, such that ultimately the NIH established this Institute for Complementary Medicine so that they'd know what people were doing, and so that what they're prescribing they could tell was not doing harm, even if people didn't admit that. And if anything, since the 90s, I think it's grown, people's self-prescription, self-medication. On the other hand, obviously, if things work, they work. But that's sort of the one sort of historical comment I'd add to give you some perspective on it. And if practitioners know the benefits and disadvantages of patients coming in, having done some research, depending on what you mean by the research, it can be helpful. It can work against it.
Great. Well, we could go on for hours, I'm sure. If people have additional questions, Bill's information is available. We'll make it available through the website, the Treats Talk, and also he's a pretty accessible guy.
Well, we're going to put that sort of brief essay I wrote up, which kind of summarizes this It's something I wrote up about 20 years ago as part of self-education and study.
But if you look at the questions, Bill, there may be some questions about historical perspective on things you may be helpful with beyond that essay, which is wonderful. Sure. And we can always direct you to Bill, and we can help too. I was going to say, Bill, I was surprised you went over on the length because you started with Hammurabi, right? So it's good, kind of, how could you possibly go over if you started with something from? And I did say the one thing to be aware of, as we all complain about the IRB, that it could be worse, that we would lose our hand for doing bad research. So I guess just we'll be thankful to our IRB friends who are on this call. So again, thanks everybody. This will be posted on our website as I described before. Thanks again, Bill, for just a great talk and a great time. So thanks everybody.